Claudia, you are muted.
There we go. Sorry about that. Okay, again, thank you all for joining our Lunch and Learn. We have people here at the chapel in Hanford, California, at the Adventist Health Chapel, and we also have quite a few people on Zoom. So I do want to welcome you in. I just want to start off again by thanking you. I'm sorry for that technical difficulty that we were having. But we're going to go ahead and get started. I am Claudia Casares. I'm the chair of the Tulare Kings Breastfeeding Coalition. We did officially merge in June 2023. So we do have here in the building Kathy Porter. She's our vice chair. We also currently have our secretary position is vacant. We also have our treasurer is Sarah Smith, and our public, our media that takes care of our Facebook page is Lupe Manzano, and then also Mona Lisa Artuda. So just a shout out to our coalition. And then if you want to follow our Facebook page, you could see there, you could follow us. We have the QR code there. Okay. All right, just really quick, some Zoom tips. We are recording the presentation, so we plan to send this presentation, the recording, by next week with some helpful handouts that our presenter is that's sharing with us. Get back to you guys next week. But we also are offering both CEU and CMEs. So we want to make sure that we are recording your Zoom correctly, your name, because we do have to provide and keep track and have a check-in list when it comes to providing the CE certificates and also the CMEs. So if you guys could just double check that your Zoom name is your full name. So please, if sometimes it has like an iPhone or has a phone number, but you could rename. You'll go ahead and click on your participants. The icon should pop up and you should be able to click on the rename button and then press OK. So we just want to make sure we have everybody's name on there, your full name, because that's what Zoom will record. Feel free throughout the presentation to show some emotions. So we have some reactions here. So you have, if you click on it, you'll be able to see we have the hearts and the crying and the laughing, but feel free to show us how you feel throughout the presentation. Those are always fun. And that's under the reaction buttons. If you have a question towards the end, we're going to do some Q&A. You can always click on the raise your hand button feature and we will be able to. So you don't have to. Sometimes as you're listening to the presentation, you may not have questions right away. If you want to wait till the end, we'll address them. But if you'd like to put in a question in the chat, we could do that. Or you could wait towards the end and for those hands raised. So here, again, the chat box, if you could just click to make sure it says everyone on there. And if you could just, in caps, put in question, that's just easier for me. So as I'm tracking the chat box, I could write down those questions and have them ready for Christine when at the end of the presentation to be able to share. So feel free to share either the questions in the chat box or, you'll raise your hand at the end of the presentation and we'll have some time to answer those. Hopefully we'll have a little bit of time to answer some of those questions. Now, this is for the continuing education. So we're going to do two things. We are keeping track with our Zoom, like I said, our Zoom attendance. When we open up the Zoom, it lets us know when you logged in, how long you were on there. So we do keep track that way. But we also have this other backup as well, is for us to compare, is if you would like continuing education, like a CE credit, there is a QR code. If you could just click on that QR code with your camera, and just fill out, it's real simple. It just makes sure that has your name and your email address. Sometimes, like I said, the Zoom, if it has a phone number, it's hard. We're not able to track it. So this is another way for us to keep track of the CE credits. So if you're interested in a CE, please click on that link. On that QR code. And then if you're interested in a CME, so this is our first time that we've been able to offer our CMEs. Now they are tracked a little different. This one is by, if you could get the QR code, they do have their own separate registration where you go through your whole evaluation. So this is separate. If you have any questions on either one of those, we do want you to email us where you got your Zoom link. you did get a email from us today, feel free to use, email us at that one, which is kcbc.tcbc@gmail. But it is in your email. Feel free to email us if you have any questions regarding the CE or the CMEs. After the presentation, hopefully by the end of the day, if not tomorrow, you will receive an evaluation for the CEs. Once you fill out that evaluation, you will be able, it'll automatically send you your certificate. Okay, and now with that, I've kind of took care of the housekeeping stuff. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand the mic over to, let's see, Carmen. And Carmen is the Tulare and Kings WIC RBL, and she will be introducing our speaker, Christine Staricka. So I'm going to go ahead and hand over the mic to her. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I just want to ask really quick for the people that are in person. I would like to know we would like to know if it was okay for us to be able to take pictures. Is everyone good with that? Yes, thank you so much. It just means a lot to us to be able to have this meeting in photos, because we are trying new things and we like to see how many people showed up and see your beautiful faces. Okay, so I just want to introduce Christine Staricka. She is a registered international board certified lactation consultant and trained childbirth educator. Christine created and developed the first 100 masterclass, a comprehensive course in optimizing early lactation, which she has taught to hundreds of people working with postpartum families. She developed the idea when she worked as a hospital-based IVF for 10 years. Christine has over 22 years experience providing clinical lactation care and support in the hospital and the community. She has been the facilitator for Baby Cafe Bakersfield since 2014, which was the first licensed baby cafe to open in California. As the host of Evolve Lactation Community, a membership and coaching program for aspiring and new lactation consultants, her current role focuses on training and coaching current and aspiring lactation care providers. She also hosts Evolve Lactation podcast and writes a blog on Substack called Evolve Lactation. Christine is a fellow of the International Lactation Consultant Association. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Phoenix. She has been married for 29 years, lives in California, and is the proud mother of 3 amazing daughters. Everyone, welcome Christine.
Hello, everyone. I am just screen sharing, making sure that I have the right things on the screen for you, and moving around my toolbars here so we can go. Okay, it looks like you should be able to see me and you should be able to see my slide. I am so excited to be here today to talk about one of my very favorite topics in the whole world. And I am so thrilled to see that there are so many people who made time for this today. I really appreciate that. I want to send a special hello to everybody who gathered in person in Hanford. I know exactly where you are. I've been there, and it's a wonderful room in which to learn. So hello to all of you. Hi to everybody who joined us on Zoom. Hi to everyone at Valley Children's who's joining us. And hello to Nicola in Ireland. I saw you in the chat. That's awesome. Thank you for being here. I know that it's not the middle of the day for you, so I appreciate that you are here. So today we are going to talk about optimizing lactation care for the late preterm and early term infant. For the most part, you're going to hear about the late preterm infant. And I have so much to share, so I want to get started as quickly as possible. But first, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that I was born and raised on the unceded lands of the Mattencock people, which you probably know as New York. And I gave birth to my 3 daughters on, and I live and practice on the unceded lands of the Yokuts people. I have no relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies to disclose for this or any presentation that I make. I do acknowledge that I have unearned privilege in this world, and I try to point out for you any time in which that is extremely relevant in what I'm saying and what I am sharing with you and what I'm encouraging for you to be able to do in your work. I truly believe that with the right lactation care information and techniques, we can have incredibly positive impacts on the health of late preterm babies and their parents. And the way that that can play out is by mitigating some of the risks and the issues that happen for these babies because they're born early. It can help increase the amount of human milk that they receive throughout their infancy. And it can have an impact on the health of their parents as well in many, many ways. Today, we will be specifically talking about characteristics of the late preterm baby, which affects their capacity to chest or breastfeed effectively, 3 breastfeeding techniques that can be used to improve chest and breastfeeding specifically, and also milk production. We're going to pay attention to both of those things because both are critical to be thinking about when we're doing lactation work. And then we're also going to explain 3 ways to support the lactating parent of a late preterm infant to optimize their early nutrition and outcomes. And the way the handout that I'm providing for you is really specifically about that. And so I think you're really going to enjoy being able to take that with you. So before we start, I just want to sort of set the scene for you. If you look at the clock right now and you count out from now 2.5 hours, and you, if you were to set the timer on your phone or your watch and you were to set it for 2.5 hours from now, I want you to think about this. If you were the parent of a late preterm baby right now, and right now at this moment, you were working on breastfeeding and or expressing your milk, like in this moment, that's what you were doing. You would need to be setting your watch or your phone alarm to go off in 2.5 hours so you could start the whole process again, no matter how long it takes. And I want you to keep that in mind. This is an all day, all night, all the time thing that people are thinking about. And that's why we're going to spend so very much time talking about it. If we aren't teaching folks how to keep track and, make these accommodations into the routine of their life, it's very easy for things to sort of catch up on them where there aren't enough feedings in a 24-hour period, there aren't enough milk expressions, and things begin to change very rapidly. So there's a lot to be said about the timing and routines of what's happening for these families that we really need to be hyper aware of. Before we get into it, I want to address a few things. There's a lot of discussion about mental health and breastfeeding in the news because partly because there's a new medication that will be able to treat some postpartum mood disorders. And just because in general, there's a lot of messaging out there around mental health and breastfeeding. So I want to ask you to please make sure that you are not spreading the message that breastfeeding causes mental health issues, because that is an incomplete statement that is extremely misleading, and that message is going around. Yesterday in my mailbox, I was so excited that my new book showed up, Depression in New Mothers. I have it right here next to me because I want to read something to you from this book. Of course, a lactation consultant gets a book the day before a presentation and has to sneak in an extra slide. But this is one of the things that is in this book. And what this book is really is a compendium of the research and evidence that is out there around mental health and breastfeeding. And so one of the quotes I really appreciate here is that breastfeeding is a sophisticated and integrated system that protects mothers and babies and helps them both navigate postpartum stresses. Yes, breastfeeding can be stressful in the beginning, but that stress indicts the maternity systems that fail to provide support for it, and it's not a reason to encourage mothers to avoid it. The scope of this presentation does not allow me to expand any further, but it's enough to say breastfeeding does not cause mental health issues. It is far more nuanced than that. And here's the thing, when someone plans to breastfeed their baby, our role is to go into assisting them with no agenda, no thoughts of persuading or talking people into or out of anything. We are there to help with informed consent, to support every person to meet their own breastfeeding goals without making any assumptions and without allowing any biases to become involved. And those can be explicit biases or implicit biases, the kind that are inside of us that don't always show up on the outside, but they impact how we act. So what we're looking for here is what is the optimal level and content of the lactation education and support that someone needs in order to be able to meet their breastfeeding goals. Because breastfeeding is instinctive, but breastfeeding here and now today in 2023 is a learned skill because it needs to be accomplished in the context of many obstacles and challenges. And I want you to know that how healthcare workers like us feel about breastfeeding, how much they trust that it is safe, effective, and important, has a tremendous effect on the individuals for whom we are providing care because it impacts the type of lactation care and support we provide. This is why it's so important that all healthcare workers maintain a professional and scientific approach to breastfeeding rather than allowing personal experiences and biases to impact how we care for our patients and clients. So let's talk about what late preterm birth really is. The definition is that a baby who is born between 34 plus 0 weeks and 36 plus 6 weeks is late preterm, while a baby who is 37 plus 0 to 38 plus 6 is early term. And many of these babies act similar to one another in all the ways we're going to talk about. So let's look at some stats for a second here. This is from the most current March of Dimes report card, which came out last month. In 2021, the preterm birth rate went up since 2020. So now we're at 10.5% of all births. Now, when we look at that number of births, the 10.5%, 70% of those at least are late preterm. So most of the babies who are preterm are actually late preterm. Now, interestingly, Asian women had the largest increase in preterm births as compared with other women. And that's a different statistic than we've seen in the past. So that hopefully is not the beginning of a trend, but simply an anomaly. But we do know from the statistics that Black and American Indian and Alaskan Native women are 62% more likely to give birth prematurely. And Black and American Indian and Alaskan Native babies are twice as likely to die before their first birthday than white babies. I take a moment here to pause because those numbers are really, really important. There is a critical connection between infant health, maternal health, and the health of a family. All are dependent on their lived social context, the quality and accessibility of healthcare, and the policies within a state. That is a direct quote from the March of Dimes report card. This is the reason that we're here to talk about this today, and this is how you can make a bigger impact. Because let's face it, if you're a lactation care provider, many of the dyads that you work with have late preterm babies. It's the reason they're having breastfeeding problems in the first place, and they are it's very possible to impact them in a positive way with the right information. But where they're starting from, their starting line is different, because what happens is people who have less access to prenatal care and they have more, they're more likely to give birth prematurely. And if they had less prenatal care, they're less likely to have any breastfeeding education or even enough information about breastfeeding to make an informed decision about infant feeding. So we need to be clear and upfront with the people that we work with about what the importance of breastfeeding and human milk are to their babies. So this is a study that was published in 2020, which really reminds us that late preterm infants are at increased risk for morbidities involving nearly every organ system. So we know that there are neurodevelopment impairments that has been a concern, and there's research around that. But we also see from the research that caring for this high-risk population contributes a significant financial burden to health systems. And that's setting aside the burden that it is on an individual family. But here's what we need to remember about these babies. They require rapid extrauterine brain growth because that's what they missed by being born early. So much of what happens for babies in the last few weeks before they're born is brain growth and brain development. So what we need to do now that they're on the outside and we don't have a time machine to take them back in, we need to optimize their nutrition and optimize the environment in which they are living around this need for extrauterine brain growth. We also know that emphasis on brain growth and development are strong motivators for parents to optimize the early care and environment of their babies. And what that plays out to is that sometimes, just like with preterm babies, when we talk to the parents of late preterm babies, when we explain to them exactly what is different about their baby than a term baby, they may be more likely to choose to feed their own milk and to breastfeed because we are talking to them about the specific vulnerabilities and needs that their babies have. So this can change their infant feeding decision, but only if we tell them this. If we pretend that their babies are just smaller term babies, which they're not, but if we act as if they are, how are they going to make an informed decision about how to feed their babies? They need this information and they deserve it. One way to think about what makes late preterm babies different from term babies is that they don't start at the same starting line. So it's like they have to catch up. They need some time to catch up in certain ways. That usually happens around or after their original due date. So the way that this plays out is that some of these babies are born with issues that have to be addressed right away medically, things that have to do with their respiratory system, and other problems that they can have, which would mean, this baby's going to the NICU. But many of them don't have any of those problems. However, across the board, most of them don't feed well. And so what we end up having is babies who are in the NICU who are getting at least some support with nutrition and with feeding, but then we have babies who are with their parents. If we don't tell their parents how to make sure they're getting enough food, they can't really do it on their own. So one of the things that we know about how exclusive breastfeeding works is that we trust that a healthy term baby can signal that they need to go to the breast frequently enough, and they can stay there long enough and do all the work that they need to do to get all the milk that they need, and that whole system and routine will be enough to signal the lactating parent's body to make all the milk that baby needs. And that cycle works together in synchrony. When we work with late preterm babies, we cannot start at that same assumption because these babies do not have that capacity. So that means they cannot be held responsible for getting all the food that they need by communicating that they need it. They cannot stay at the breast long enough to get all the milk that they need. And the signals that they are sending to their parent's body are not enough to maintain milk production. So if you take away nothing else, if you click out of this meeting right now, that's the most important thing that we really want to emphasize here. They really are not able to be responsible for enough milk intake and enough integration with the system of milk production. One of the reasons this happens is because for late preterm babies, they do not have the maturity in their brainstem to be able to do those things. So the neural control of breathing and the respiratory rhythm are happening in the brainstem, but the immaturity that these babies possess means that because they're immature, this impacts their ability to arouse themselves, their sleep-wake cycles, and their coordination of feeding and breathing. They have a neurologically underdeveloped gut. Now, remember that in lactation, the lactation process with a healthy term baby, when the baby is born, at first, there is colostrum present to feed them. And it's very thick and it flows slowly and comes in small volumes. One of the reasons that that works with what that newborn needs is because that baby needs a little bit of time to coordinate their suck, swallow, breathe cycle. They don't need a lot of time, though, when they're born at term and their brainstem is mature. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about late preterm babies who are going to need much more time to coordinate their suck, swallow, and breathe because their brainstem is not as mature. So let's think about for a second, when you run into somebody or somebody in your life has a baby who's born at 32 weeks, everyone knows what that means, right? Like every friend, family member, coworker, whatever, everybody says, oh, wow. And they have this sense of, okay, this is going to be hard for this family. They're going to need to do some extra work and there's going to be some risks and some vulnerabilities. And maybe they're not going to take this baby out so much. And they're going to have this sense that this is going to be really different. But when you have a 35-week baby, no one thinks anything of it really, unless they are, involved in the work that we do or have some medical knowledge in pediatrics or, in obstetrics. Being born late preterm is really different than being born 32 weeks or 27 weeks because the baby doesn't really look different. They just look small. All the issues that they tend to have are not visible on the outside. So these families often they don't get sympathy, they don't get fanfare, they don't get people offering to help beyond the stuff that people normally offer. Oh, let me know if I can do anything, which is kind of a useless thing to say, right? And they end up taking home a baby with vulnerabilities that other people can't see. They may have been talked out of worrying about this baby being early, like if they had to be induced. So you get into this cycle where if there's a medical issue for the pregnant person and the reality becomes that induction is necessary to protect their health and the health of the baby. Okay, yes, we have to take your baby right now. It's only 35 weeks, but the risks of the baby staying in and you staying pregnant are high. Okay, accepted. However, once that baby is born, we have to be willing to talk about what it means for a baby to be born at 35 weeks. We have to discuss the vulnerabilities that they have. That is a consequence of being born early. And just because the reason that they were born early is valid doesn't make the consequences not happen. And oftentimes we see that people have been sort of talked out of worrying about that part of it because the induction or whatever happened. There's nothing we can do about that part, but we still have to be really clear and upfront about what's going on now. So we have to make sure that we're teaching people the right things at the right time. So one thing that I want to emphasize today is that when we are working with dyads where the baby is late preterm, depending on your level of practice, how much time you get to spend with patients or clients, and how big your scope of practice is when it comes to clinical lactation care, we may be seeing that this baby has multiple problems. It's a very complex lactation scenario, problems with milk production, problems with intake, problems with latch or attachment. There may be so very many things going on, but you must make sure that what you always take away from that and what you emphasize, pull out of that whole situation is that the baby is late preterm, and that is the issue. That is the top priority issue, not the rest of those things. Not that they're not important, but the being late preterm is the most important thing we have to remember. Because what these families need to understand is that this baby may take more work to feed now, but that's not a forever thing. What breastfeeding or lactation looks like today is not what it's going to look like forever. It's not what breastfeeding means. It's what this baby needs right now because they were born late preterm. Because often what we see is that people who have late preterm babies who go into the situation wanting to breastfeed their baby often find that the baby can't latch or can't stay latched. They can't get enough milk when they're at the breast, and they need to do a lot of extra pumping and extra feeding of the baby. So before long, all of those extra tasks and that extra workload becomes unsustainable for them. That's understandable. It becomes unsustainable, and so they stop completely. And what we want to do is set people up for success so that they understand that the work they are doing is not because they failed, their baby doesn't want to, they're not trying hard enough, anything like that. It's all about the baby having been born a little bit early. And it's not a forever permanent situation of how breastfeeding is always going to be for them. This is so important context to be able to put around that workload so that it doesn't bury them and cause them to stop completely. So like it's really important, for instance, in the hospital, when we teach people how to use a breast pump, and when we're encouraging them to start pumping super early, like way earlier than they probably thought they were going to, we're telling them why. It's not because they're going back to work at 3 weeks. It's because their baby was born early and their baby's probably going to need the extra milk that they're going to be able to get. So we need to make sure that we're teaching them accurately around all the practices that we're encouraging, because we don't want them to misunderstand the purpose and then stop doing it or think that their baby can never latch or anything like that. We want people to have this much more clear sense that it is a temporary situation, which requires, in some cases, a lot of extra work. And, you know, we understand that that's frustrating, but if we give them that information up front, then they can make the choice that they want to make with that information. And if they want to continue, we have the information and the support that they need to be able to continue. So let's look at just a few things that pulled from the research here. This one from 2022, professional support significantly improved exclusive breastfeeding rates in this literature search of 9 articles. So really, really very important that we encourage all lactating dyads that have a late preterm baby really need to be seen by a skilled clinical lactation care provider, which would be an IBCLC or a breastfeeding medicine physician. This study in 2020 talked again about the risk of various morbidities and mortality, but also focused on increasing the risk for readmission following hospital discharge. So again, these babies who don't go to the NICU, go home with their parents, often come back in the first 30 days. And that is a terrible situation, terribly traumatic for families to have to go through. So we want to be really upfront with them about how to care for their babies right from the beginning, especially if they're not going to the NICU. This one from 2020 looked at these hospitalizations. Now, while late preterm babies had a higher risk of all-cause hospitalizations after having gone home, rehospitalization of late preterm babies for gastrointestinal infections was lower in exclusively human milk-fed babies. We know this. We know that exclusive human milk feeding is extremely important. It's how we optimize outcomes and mitigate risks and challenges. And again, I don't have the scope in this presentation to go into all the reasons why we should be encouraging and promoting exclusivity of human milk feeding and feeding at the breast whenever possible. But, you know, we can really quickly just think microbiome. That's really the key here, and not introducing foreign proteins into this baby's gut, and avoiding any potential exposure to pathogens through the feeding of non-human milk. Really, really important things to remember, and definitely plays out in the research in terms of outcomes for these babies. This 2018 study talked about breastfeeding self-efficacy, and we know that that is a really easy to measure score that basically is about confidence. You know, how well does a person believe that they can breastfeed? Do they have that confidence that they can make it happen? And that if there's a problem that they will be able to overcome it. And if somebody starts out with really low self-efficacy, their outcomes tend to be lower. If they start out with high self-efficacy, they tend to be higher. But it's really easy to impact that self-efficacy with treating the whole situation with doubts, bad information, discouragement instead of encouragement. But this study specifically showed that everything that we already knew about breastfeeding self-efficacy, it holds true with the mothers and parents of late preterm babies as well. So we need to do all the work that we can to support them as well as possible. Sorry about that. I missed a slide there. So again, we want to keep in mind that for most parents, there's a lack of understanding that their babies are not just small term newborns. And so when they start to encounter breastfeeding problems, what are they going to do? How does the modern parent address a breastfeeding problem? What is the first thing they do? They pick up their phone and they Google it. They look for information so that they can help themselves. They talk to people they know and they talk to people they know online. The problem is their baby isn't like everyone else's baby. So their lactation situation is not like other people's situations. They need specific information that pertains to them and their baby. So just like in all lactation things, where I always like to remind people that our job as lactation care providers is often to be the filter, you know, for our clients. They're finding all kinds of stuff online, and we're helping them filter what is actually relevant to them and their baby. One example of how this can play out is that, you know, people run into these problems with feeding their baby. They're doing all this extra work. And of course, babies and sleep are, you know, intertwined in ways that we're still working on the science to pick it all apart, right? And so when they start to encounter these problems, if they try to address these problems in the same way that the parent of a term newborn would address them, they could actually be placing their baby at higher risk. So one example of this would be putting a late preterm baby into one of these sleep training programs or routines or schedules that are everywhere. You know, when you go on social media and online, you can find these things that people are encouraging or saying your baby should sleep this much and at this time and only feed at this time. Well, those are not really congruent with what the late preterm baby needs neurodevelopmentally. They cannot be forced to wake and sleep according to some arbitrary plan, and their feeding needs to be really closely monitored. So they can't be limiting feedings to only certain times. They aren't going to get enough food if arbitrary plans are being applied to them. Everything needs to be really personalized and customized for this baby and their particular needs. So these are going to be the 3 T's of what we talk about today, just so that there's an easy way for you to remember. We're going to talk about teaching, we're going to think about timelines, and we're going to talk about techniques. When you're working with somebody whose baby was born late preterm and maybe is 1 or 2 weeks old at this point, they're not thriving, the baby or the parent. It's emotional, it's overwhelming, and sometimes what you have to share with them is a lot of work, extra work that they're going to have to do. It's not your job to determine whether or not they can do that work or whether it's too much of a burden for them. It's our job to share with them what needs to happen and work with them on a plan that can work in their household, in their family. But we have to put that into context. That's what the teaching's all about. It's not just you have to do this. It's here's what it requires to increase your milk production at this point. Here's what needs to happen. So how can we work through this together? You want to explain to them what's different about their baby. You want them to be really clear that this isn't about mistakes they made or things they missed or anything like that. This is about what their baby needs. Confirm it's not their fault. Get a clear vision of what they actually want to do. Be really explicit with the questions that you ask about what their plans and goals are. Explain what kinds of possible changes to the routine they could make in order to start to get toward their goal. Reaffirm you understand, you acknowledge they are doing extra work, probably far beyond what they thought they were going to need to do. And it's not permanent. It's not forever. You're resetting the timelines for them. You're validating what they're doing. You're reassuring them that it is possible to accomplish their goals, and you're building their confidence. You are really making a mindset shift for them, but it doesn't have to be permanent. They don't have to do all these extra things forever. This is what we can actually impact by doing this for folks. Sometimes what we see happen in our practice is that as an IBCLC, I actually had this case happen to me, and that's why I included this slide. Working with a late preterm baby and their parent, had a really good plan going because things were not going well. So we set up a really good plan and got, I think it was about 8 or 9 days into this plan, parent was able to do all the things that, needed to be done to increase milk production and get more milk in the baby. That was really important. It wasn't happening at the breast, so we needed to get some more milk in the baby. And then it was time for another follow-up with their midwife, and then came back to see me several days later when I learned that, their plan had changed and their routine had changed and they were doing some different things. And so we talked a little bit about, what was hard about the plan and why they changed it, because sometimes people change, what they're doing because life and they have to, and, things come up and they didn't realize it was going to be like this. But actually, in this case, what happened was when they talked to the midwife didn't really understand the reality of the late preterm baby. So as soon as the midwife heard that they were essentially triple feeding, they were feeding the baby, they were expressing milk, and then they were feeding the baby with a device, she said, "Oh, you don't have to do that. That's too hard. People can't do that. Everybody tells you have to do that, but you can't be doing that. That's just like too much work." And so, this tired and overwhelmed parent was like, "That sounds great. I don't think I want to do all that anymore." Okay. Well, was that really an informed choice about how to get to their goal? Not really. That was more of like an opinion that triple feeding is too hard for you. That's not something we get to decide for people. So when other healthcare providers come in to the situation and they don't understand the needs of the late preterm baby, they don't get why this person is breastfeeding and pumping, or why this person is breastfeeding and giving bottles afterward, they may talk them out of it. They may go in and say to somebody who has a plan even in the first few days of breastfeed, and then we give formula after while we're working on milk production. They may go in and say, "Everybody tells you have to use formula, but babies don't need that. It's, exclusive breastfeeding is really important." Well, sure, if the baby is getting enough and isn't late preterm. So there's always these situations where it's very easy for the sort of mainstream breastfeeding information to get morphed in these kind of late preterm situations into something that becomes unsafe for the baby. So when somebody is working with parents of a late preterm baby and giving them really specific information that is going to keep their baby safe, they need to know why they're doing that so that they don't stop just because their Aunt Linda told them that they don't really need to be giving that extra formula. Did their Aunt Linda evaluate the baby's intake? I don't think so. So it's very important that we are explaining these things. We need folks to know that this extra attention and focus around feeding is important. Their baby's going to need to be seen by the doctor every week until feeding is really well established. So that can look very different from a term baby who goes in, a few days after they go home from the hospital, or, maybe the day after or 2 days after, and then they don't go back till 2 weeks. And then after that, when do they go back? A month, maybe? What if they don't go back for 2 months and feeding isn't going well all that time? They are recommended by the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine to be seen in a medical office every week, at least, for weight checks at a minimum. Can be more frequent if needed, can involve, more medical evaluation if possible and if needed. But for sure, every week weight checks to make sure that feeding is actually being established well and going well. And I take that a step further, lactation care, at least that frequently, to ensure that every part of lactation is being protected in all the ways that it needs to. Because you can watch a baby grow and, have better weight on the scale every week, especially if that baby is being supplemented away from the breast. But you can also watch at the same time milk production go down. So really needs to be full evaluation, lots and lots of continuity of care. So we really need to make sure that we're sharing this information with people outside of the birthing world and the world that we work in, so that everybody knows, so that the person that if the lactating parent is going back in for their follow-up checkup with their doctor at 6 weeks or 8 weeks, they're not getting talked out of things that they actually need to do for their late preterm baby. We need better information getting out to everyone about late preterm babies, just so that people understand why it seems so hard for certain parents to navigate the first weeks of life with their new baby, because not all new babies are born at 39 weeks or 40 weeks or 41 weeks. Some of them are born earlier and they need extra attention and different kinds of care. And we as lactation care providers need to have modern and reliable resources that we can use, like what we're talking about today, like the tool I'm going to share with you afterward, so that we are appropriately prepared for this work. This is not like working with families with term babies. We have to know different information. We have to be prepared to support them through different types of problems and challenges. This literature review from 2023 was just a little bit more about breastfeeding self-efficacy, but really, again, backs that up, that all healthcare professionals should be properly trained in the appropriate management of breastfeeding in late preterm infants. So what this, really spoke to me about is that I often see people whose own pediatricians have not really talked to them about their baby being late preterm and what that might mean for feeding. They're, again, being lumped in with term babies, and they have different and more specific needs. So some of the key practices that we can do, this is, sort of getting into the techniques part. And I use the quotes here on the screen to sort of script this for you. Kangaroo care or skin-to-skin care. Late preterm babies need to be skin-to-skin nearly all the time. In particular, in the hospital, in the first hours and days of life, skin-to-skin is extremely important for them. It continues to be just as important after they have gone home. The more time they spend in kangaroo care or skin-to-skin, the easier it's going to be for their brain to adapt and do that extra uterine growth that it needs to do. Because remember, they missed out on that brain development by being born early. What's the best place they can do that? It's in a place where their body is the least stressed, which is skin to skin. So on top of all the things that we also know about skin to skin and how it promotes milk production and better breastfeeding behaviors, we also have to know that it takes away many of the body stressors that happen for these babies, like trying to stay warm. When they're struggling to stay warm, they are burning through energy way too fast. And again, these are babies who sometimes aren't getting enough food in the first place. So if they're now also burning through that energy trying to stay warm, this is also a problem. So to keep these babies in the least stressful situation, this means lots and lots of skin to skin. That is not what most modern American parents are expecting to do with their babies when they bring them home. They're not even expecting to do it in the hospital after the first hour. So this is a really different scene to set up for them. The more you talk about it, explain it, help them think through what it's going to be like, How are they going to manage it if there's one parent in that household and there's no partner? How are they going to manage as much skin to skin as they are able to do? If there are two parents, how are they going to share this duty so that they can take care of the rest of their responsibilities? This study here, just from this year, talked about using kangaroo care also as a method of making sure that breast milk secretion, breast milk production, was going to be optimized as well. And this study actually showed they use these interventions of educating early about feeding human milk, pumping early, and then using kangaroo care a lot. Like they increased a lot the kangaroo care that they were doing. And they actually did improve these outcomes. The full, what they called the full breast milk feeding rate of hospitalized late preterm infants. So these were babies in a NICU who got these QI interventions, and they were able to get more human milk and for longer while they were in the hospital because of these practices. So the next one's going to be human contact during feeding. So one of the things we see with late preterm babies is that they may be feeding at the breast on the body. They may be feeding with a variety of different devices. There might be human milk in those devices. There might be formula in those devices, but it's super important that their feeding is happening with human contact. In the same way that we sometimes gloss over or forget to talk about the fact that with breastfeeding, babies switch sides, so they get that alternating visual development of being on both sides of the body. And we're supposed to be teaching people who are using bottles about the same thing so that they remember to switch sides when they're bottle feeding. We don't always remember to talk about that. It seems like just one more thing. Late preterm babies, they need this even more. But on top of that, they also need these opportunities to be on the body, having human contact, having skin to skin around feeding times, so that they can begin to practice all of those behaviors and movements that will lead them into successful breastfeeding if they're not doing it already. We need them to have a lot of opportunities to practice all the things they need to do to breastfeed so that they can eventually breastfeed. If somebody stops trying to breastfeed, how is their baby going to breastfeed? Like that's, that's just one of those things that it's so logical when you think about it. And I worked with somebody who actually now is an IBCLC whose baby didn't latch for 13 weeks. And after 13 weeks and a lot of lactation care and a lot of other things, her baby latched and continued to breastfeed until they were both ready to wean for several years. And the most important takeaway from that whole story is that if she had stopped after 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks, and she had never allowed that baby back to the breast, she never would have been able to latch. We have to encourage people that every opportunity, every chance, every time they take to have their baby skin to skin, bring their baby to the breast is important in their future ability to breastfeed. It's very important for them to practice, even if they're not efficient. If they can breastfeed for 2 minutes today, and they do that a couple times, and next week, some of their breastfeedings are 5 minutes, even if most of their feeding happens away from the chest, all of the time that they spend there practicing the behaviors that surround breastfeeding are extremely important to their future ability to do it. This is one of the things that we see frequently with babies who are in the NICU and then go home. If we send babies home from a NICU and they've never had an opportunity to try breastfeeding, do we imagine that this is magically going to happen when they go home simply because they've gone home? Because I'm going to tell you right now, it doesn't. It's not magic. Just because you've brought your baby home from the NICU does not mean that now you can breastfeed. Because if you've never even tried, neither one of you has any experience. It's really hard to learn that without the supports of being inside a place where assistance is provided to you. So we need to make sure that babies are getting all these opportunities to practice. If it is done skin to skin, the baby is allowed to or facilitated to move through all of their breastfeeding practices, even if that's not the way they feed. This is not burning extra energy. This is not tiring them out. That's not what skin to skin does. Skin to skin is important because it relieves all those other stressors that make them burn energy faster. When they're skin to skin, they're less stressed. There's no reason to stress a baby, and having them skin to skin is going to help them manage the stress that they have, practice their breastfeeding behaviors around the time of feeding so that they can get better. And as time goes on and that brainstem begins to mature, their feedings can transition to a different way. Next, let's talk about milk expression. Taking milk out helps you make more milk. That's just the reality of how it works. And we always, we liked to say before supply and demand, but that can be confusing for parents sometimes, believe it or not. It's not the easiest thing to translate exactly. So it's very important they understand that when they have a late preterm baby, if their baby is not efficiently moving milk out of the breast, they have to back that up, because remember we talked earlier about not trusting these babies to be in charge of milk production. We can't leave them in charge of their own intake. We have to watch out for it. We have to often supplement it. And we have to monitor milk expression and milk production. So often that means that a breastfeeding late preterm baby, there's also some milk expression that's required. It helps to ensure their growth by providing something. Now you have some expressed milk that you can also feed to them if they require that. Plus, it aids in making sure we're protecting milk production long term. So no matter how well they're breastfeeding, until they have demonstrated that they themselves can be responsible for getting enough milk so that they grow and protecting milk production, some kind of milk expression is going to have to happen in the background. It's really important. So additional feeding, this is going to be feeds that happen away from the breast or chest. It's an individual thing. It's not that every late preterm baby needs additional feeding. Many of them do, but they have to be evaluated to know this. But once we've determined that they do, until the baby shows they can do it well over and over, we help them get enough milk. However, that is chosen to happen by the family, whether they want to use cup feeding, bottle feeding. If they have a baby who latches, maybe they're able to use a supply line or supplementer. That's not always a possibility. That's a complicated clinical lactation skill. So it's important to think about all the different ways that you can get extra milk into a baby so that they get adequate volumes and grow appropriately. And then can taper off with the additional feeds as they begin to breastfeed or chest feed better, as they demonstrate that they're able to get all the milk that they need at the breast. And of course, this also requires knowledge of how babies get enough, which is by making sure that they are permitted to stay at the breast for as long as they are actively feeding, and then go back as soon as they say that they're ready. So that transition part of we do these extra things to help them to the point where they're acting and feeding more like term babies, that can be a tricky part. So it's very important that this lactation support that they're getting does not taper off, but works them all the way through this transition so that we can watch out for warning signs that maybe they aren't breastfeeding as well as they could, or that families are starting to pick up on routines or habits that they're hearing from the outside about term babies and how they feed. And they're maybe limiting feedings again, or, only feeding at certain times or only for a certain amount of minutes. Those things do not lead to babies being able to take in enough milk. Putting limits on breastfeeding does not lead to a baby being able to get enough. They have to be supported to be able to feed as long as they need to and as often as they need to. So another practice that we want to talk about is just making sure that families understand that this baby is going to do better at their own pace. We can't predict it. We can't tell them exactly when everything's going to be all better. We want to be proactive with them so that they are backing up that milk production so they don't lose their milk production or, have problems with providing enough for the baby. We want to make sure that without, if they're learning to breastfeed in the hospital and they're late preterm, we're making sure they're not going home not knowing how to use a bottle. We can't assume families know how to bottle feed appropriately. Any baby can have any number of problems with bottle feeding that makes feeding stressful. We should never be sending people away without teaching them how to use the tools that they have asked to use to feed their baby. It's really important that if they are going to use a tool, they know how to use it safely and effectively. Bottles are the most common way that American families feed their babies away from the body. It's important that if they are using or say they are going to, we make sure that they know how to feed their baby with a bottle in a safe and effective way, because late preterm babies can often have issues managing the flow that comes from a bottle. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about the pace of the baby being their own. Some late preterm babies are going to start showing much better feeding outcomes by about the time that they should have been born, so around their due date, and others are going to take longer than that. Occasionally, we'll see late preterm babies who really don't show any problems with feeding even from the beginning, but it doesn't hurt to monitor them really closely and make sure that that continues. So late preterm babies require high touch lactation care, high touch monitoring by the health system. And this kind of approach, making sure we're giving people this information right up front, helps to prevent them having negative outcomes where now we're scrambling to fix the problem. Now we're trying to rescue milk production and we're trying to catch a baby's growth up. Let's be proactive with these babies and start things early. Start hand expression right away so that there's always extra expressed milk that we can feed to them if things start out okay and then aren't so good after that. We want to keep in mind that all kinds of feeding is challenging. So when we're talking about late preterm babies, there are certain characteristics that they possess which make feeding challenging for them and affect their capacity to feed at the chest or breast effectively. They tend to have low muscle tone. They have low stamina for feeding. They can't stay on the breast for as long or even keep their latch for as long, partly because of that low muscle tone, also because of things like less fat padding in their cheeks, which is part of how babies stay latched at the breast. Their body has competing needs for the energy and resources that it's taking in. They have those less regulated sleep and wake cycles. So that means that their feeding cues are not reliable because they're not waking and sleeping in the same way that a term baby does. And we talked earlier about that immature suck, swallow, breathe coordination, which we cannot predict. We cannot speed up. We cannot figure out when that's going to happen. It's a function of brainstem maturation. We don't know when it's going to happen. We can't force it. We can't speed it up. We just have to be patient, watch the baby, and help them with anything that they need help with. So often what this turns into is that late preterm moms need to do earlier milk expression. Starting hand expression as early as possible after birth is always a good idea when there's a late preterm baby. We need to track their outcomes, like including those weekly weight checks to make sure that everything is on track and that things don't fall off without anyone noticing. They need much more skin to skin in their lives than parents are expecting to need to do. In the home, we need to encourage parents and help them figure out ways to reduce environmental and household stressors. So we want them to understand what their babies need for normal development and think about what their normal household, for instance, light levels, volume and sound levels are. activity, people in and out of the house, going places all the time, all the things that are normal in their life, in their household, how much, if there's other kids around, how those other siblings are going to interact with the baby. They need to be anticipating things about that situation so that they can mitigate a lot of the, extra stress that might be difficult for the baby, or ensure that the way that they are practicing skin to skin is itself going to mitigate that. Yeah, maybe it's loud when the other kids get home from school, but when the baby is skin to skin, the baby doesn't mind as much. It's not as difficult for them to manage that. They don't have to shut down quite as much because they're skin to skin. We want to make sure, again, they know how to use at least one alternate feeding device so that they can feed their baby extra whenever they need to or feel like there's a need to. We've got to talk about their nighttime routines. They have to understand that babies have needs day and night, 24/7. The nighttime does not mean babies don't need to feed or milk production doesn't need to be protected. The nighttime is just like the daytime, and prolactin levels, of course, need to be protected during the night. They need to think about where their baby is going to sleep. They need to remember that their baby has differing and less regulated sleep and wake cycles, and they need to be alert to what their baby needs, both day and night. And the easiest way to be alert to what your baby needs is to have them where you can hear and see them. So that is going to be close, in the same room in most cases. They may require more frequent doctor visits for those weight checks or any other health conditions that crop up. They may require iron supplementation in a way that term breastfed babies often do not. Because again, like they missed those last weeks of brain development, they've also missed weeks of iron stores being laid down. It's very important that they don't take on the same mindset of many exclusive breastfeeders who come across lots of information where, oh, you don't have to give your breastfed baby that because they're breastfed. You don't have to give them that. This isn't that situation. Again, we need them to understand their baby is different and has different needs than a term baby. So when it comes to things like, do they need any kind of mineral or iron supplementation? Do they need, to be woken up if they're sleeping a lot? They might need things that term babies do not. They should be considering fewer visitors to their household and to their hospital room, and fewer trips out in public to protect their more vulnerable baby from potential infection. They may need to wake that baby so the baby can get enough to eat. They may need to avoid certain positions for breastfeeding, and that also goes for smaller babies. Sometimes term babies are born small. Intrauterine growth restrictions can cause them to be born small. Those babies should not be in certain types of breastfeeding positions, and they should definitely not be left in car seats or containers for long periods of time or for sleep. They need to be monitored, and they need to make sure that they can keep their head in a position, because often they don't have the muscle tone to be able to pick their head up if their chin falls toward their chest, and that can actually impede their airway. They should consider baby wearing, using a sling or some type of a baby wrap as a therapeutic choice for their baby, rather than thinking of it as like, that's the kind of mom that I want to be, I'm going to use this carrier. It's more of something that we wear our baby in this house because we can monitor the baby better, because we can keep an eye on the baby's positioning, because we can respond to feeding cues faster, because we can ensure that our baby has less stress because we're wearing him. So thinking about the types of practices that families are doing with late preterm babies and explaining to them how those things can be therapeutic, rather than simply, well, this is the kind of parents we want to be, so these are the things we're going to do. Okay, but also the needs of your baby actually mean that those things become therapeutic for them and really help them to mitigate the stresses of being born early. Pacifier use is another one. being mindful of pacifier use and how sometimes pacifiers can mask hunger signals, especially very, very early on. It's important that, parents learn this and that they understand that if you're working with a baby on breastfeeding, who already has trouble with stamina when they're trying to stay latched to the breast, if they've had a pacifier in their mouth for 15 or 20 minutes before this feeding, they've already been sucking. Are they going to have a lot of stamina to stay at the breast? No, that may not be the right timing for that. So they may need to think about how they use the pacifier in a different way than they would if their baby was term and it was less likely to be interfering with what was happening during feeding times. And some really specific techniques that have more to do with clinical lactation care. Let's think about, so we're talking about skin to skin nearly always. That was the quote, right? Waking the baby whenever it's time to feed to make sure we're going to get enough feedings in 24 hours. Thinking about partial emptying of the breast if the milk flow becomes really fast. If there's a very strong letdown of milk when that happens, if that's a lot for the baby to handle and they start to show stress signs in their forehead or splaying out their fingers and toes, they start to show those stress signs, maybe we need to take a little milk out first before we bring that little guy in for a feeding at the body. Maybe we need to hand express a little bit of that milk, then bring the baby on when the flow slows down. Maybe we need to do some head and or jaw support or some chin support in the way that will help them to stay latched to the breast a little bit easier. Sometimes those positioning things, the jaw support and the dancer hold of the chin to help the baby keep their jaw closer, their lower jaw closer, sometimes can help with bottle feeding as well. We have to really watch and see what the baby needs. We want to make sure that they understand how to do hand expression right from the start, because it's great to say that we're teaching people how to pump, and pumping can be really important. But if you don't have your pump with you, if you lost your pump, if it fell in a puddle when you got out of the car, if your electricity is out, if you're in a flood or a fire or a refugee camp and you don't have a breast pump, you need to know how to hand express. Everybody needs to know this so that they can effectively get milk out for the baby, as well as preventing all the problems that come along with congestion and overfilling of the breasts. So hand expression for everybody. Breast compressions. Babies, when they're at the breast, should be actively feeding. So if they're no longer actively feeding, but they're still there, what parents can do is when the baby slows down and takes a pause that they don't seem to be coming back from, they've stopped, maybe they're falling asleep, compressing the breast. So when you compress the breast, what happens? Baby gets a little extra milk. If they want more milk, they'll start sucking again. If they don't, they will come off the breast. Then you will know this feeding is over and you can make that decision. Was that a lot? Was that a really short feeding and they didn't do a whole lot and the breast still feels full? I better give additional milk. Or that was a really good feeding and the baby seems done, but I'm also ready to put the baby back on as soon as they ask, right? And then that combination of, for these late preterm babies, it's really a combination of responsive feeding and parent-directed feeding. So when we teach breastfeeding to parents of healthy term babies, we talk a lot about responsive feeding because of what we discussed before. The baby is responsible for their intake by communicating when and how long they are staying at the breast. And that signals to the body about how much milk is actually needed. And that whole cycle reinforces itself over time. But with late preterm babies, we're not trusting them to do that. That doesn't mean we're totally ignoring their signals, though. When they signal that they're hungry, that they want to go to the breast, they can go to the breast. That's great. But parents also have to take some monitoring and responsibility in that, and sometimes say, You said you wanted to go to the breast and I put you on the breast and now you've been there for 20 minutes and you've done nothing, or you've fed for 2 minutes. So now this feeding is moving into its next phase because I'm the adult here, right? So it's really teaching people how to sort of make those transitions, being able to get their own direction into that feeding while not overlooking or ignoring the baby's cues, which we expect over time to increase. Late preterm babies in the first days are generally not going to communicate hunger cues very frequently, but as time goes on, we expect their hunger cues to start to increase. And of course, the more responsive we are to those, we reinforce for the baby. That is how you communicate what you need, and we will respond to that. So keep doing it. When we keep responding, they keep doing it. So making that combination really clear for parents that, you know, they need to pay attention to what their baby's asking for, and they also need to pay attention to what they intellectually know their baby needs, which sometimes means the clock. And that's a really important point to make here. It's very, common and important that parents of healthy term babies understand that breastfeeding does not happen according to the clock, and the clock should not run their breastfeeding routine. But with a late preterm baby, the clock kind of runs it. You've got to look at the clock. You've got to have the numbers. You've got to have that kind of feedback. Otherwise, things can go downhill very quickly. It's very important that they are watching the clock, that they are counting things. They're counting feedings, they're counting intake, they're counting diapers like everybody, but also that they're counting to make sure there's enough feedings in 24 hours and there's enough milk expression sessions in 24 hours to protect milk production. We want to teach these things. We want to demonstrate and role model them. We want to reinforce them. And we want them to be repeating those over time as they're noticing that things are gradually getting better. And there is a way, we're getting to that, of making sure they know that things are getting better. So right here, this study was just a small study, 72 folks in this study, but it highlighted the benefits of reducing maternal stress, since the relaxation intervention influenced infant growth and behavior, as well as breastfeeding frequency. So this wasn't just about, let's let this lactating mother, let's make sure that she's nice and relaxed. That actually improved breastfeeding and improved infant growth and behavior. So everything that we can do to remove stress and difficulty and challenge, or the perception of those things, is going to be important in this situation. Especially true for situations where the mother experiences high levels of stress or anxiety. Well, that's basically everything about having a late preterm baby, right? And mothers of infants who have low birth weight and who are admitted to the NICU. So yes, we want to promote breastfeeding, but we also want to promote that practices around feeding times and lactation activities that are helpful for inducing relaxation for the mother and parent are also going to help with the breastfeeding and growth situation. So whatever that means, whether that means music, massage, all the things that improve the sensory experiences, skin to skin, warmth, time spent with other loved ones, hugs from the other kids while you're pumping, all the things that increase oxytocin are going to help with all of these activities of lactation that can feel overwhelming and burdensome for the mothers of late preterm babies. We're optimizing their whole lactation routine by being proactive. We're looking for progress. We are helping them to see all early feeds that we're supplementing with expressed colostrum, because there are no known risks or disadvantages to doing that. Even with healthy term babies, you can encourage responsive, on-demand, on-cue, exclusive breastfeeding, but also do some hand expression and feed some colostrum after those feeds or in between. It can help. With late preterm babies, especially, we know that you're going to need help with promoting milk production. So let's get some hand expression started really, really quickly. waking the baby to make sure we're getting those 8 or more feeds, and then treating these scenarios the same way that we care for those who are exclusively pumping. Even if they're also breastfeeding, when somebody has a late preterm baby, let's think primarily of their situation in terms of milk production being they need to do everything that an exclusive pumper is doing. So if we know it works for them, we've got to make sure that it's happening for these late preterm babies too, even if they're also sometimes breastfeeding a little, working on breastfeeding, because it's going to take time for that breastfeeding to really improve and establish well. And the way we know this is going to happen, the progress that parents can see, is easily laid out in the preterm infant breastfeeding behavior scale, which you can find online. Anybody can find it. It's a very reliable tool. It's a scientifically validated tool that was created to help the parents of preterm babies see progress in their babies, but it also works for late preterm babies, according to this study from 2020. It teaches them exactly what behaviors to look at so they can evaluate current and future experiences. What does progress mean? What does it look like, and how to measure it? So it's very specific. It's like the baby opened their mouth at the breast, then they licked it, then they nuzzled it, then they attempted to latch, then they latched and sucked a few times, then they latched and sucked more than a few times, and they did suck cycles of 8 to 10. It's very easy to measure those things when you know what to look for. So that's a very easy scale that we can teach to people about what to look for. And then finally, just one last place to land here. Sometimes it's going to get frustrating, not just for the parents, but for you. You've supported, you've taught, you've encouraged, you've done everything that you know how to do clinically. Oh my goodness, you feel like you've done the whole entire toolbox. Sometimes it's just not getting better. Maybe, in this situation, there was a tongue tie release. The jaundice is finally resolved. Milk production is back up after a dip. There's been maybe some work on torticollis or other issues that required body work or anything else for the baby. But you may still be looking at a late preterm baby. That's what you've got to remind yourself. And that's what you want to remind your clients. Sometimes in the beginning with these late preterm babies, they're absolutely overwhelmed by an onslaught of necessary oral skill acquisition. So what that really means is when you think about skill acquisition for babies, babies are better at learning one thing at a time. But unfortunately, these aren't the kind of babies that can only learn one way of feeding. It doesn't work that way for them. So they end up having to learn multiple things at a time. And that's hard. That is just going to mean that each thing that they're trying to get better at is going to take longer and longer. If they're not effective at breastfeeding, they're going to have to use another tool to feed. So that means they're going to get good at that thing first, and breastfeeding might take a little bit longer. It's not permanent. It takes time. It's about time and patience and giving grace to the situation. Always encouraging the parent that what is happening is within the normal expectations and limits. And this is a good place to just remind us all that when we think about the baby-friendly hospital initiative and the baby-friendly scenario, they've taken in the guidelines and they've said right from the beginning, here are all the things that you need to do for healthy term babies and their mothers and parents, right? Late preterm babies, they don't count. Move them over. They go in a different bucket. We don't count them in this. Why? Because they're different and they have different needs. There's a totally different set of rules for babies who go to the NICU. But even on the regular postpartum unit, late preterm babies are not counted in the exclusive breastfeeding rates or any of those things because they have different feeding needs. Caring for them and feeding them requires extra attention and extra work by hospital staff, by medical care providers, and by parents. It's very important that we just keep that in context That is what we expect. When we shift our expectations to know that that's what we expect to be happening, it doesn't seem as weird. It doesn't seem as different than the norm. It is the norm. That's what we expect. If we expect everything in healthy term babies to be in this box, late preterm babies, we've got to give them a bigger box. We've got to give them a bigger time window in which they can improve things. Encouragement and validation for mothers and parents go an incredibly long way. We really want to remember that forever. We want to constantly remind ourselves of that. So I want to say thank you to everyone here and everyone watching the recording for the work that you do in your scope, in your practice, in your setting every single day to promote health in general and to help parents and babies thrive. I'd also like to remind you to do your own breast self-exams so that you can keep doing it, prevent problems for yourself, because these parents and babies, they need you. So we want you to be healthy as well throughout your lifespan. And I just want to thank you one more time for being here. And I encourage you to connect with me if you have questions. I'm going to stick around now, but you also are welcome to email me or to send me a message on Instagram. I would love to hear from you and get some feedback. I understand I didn't cover probably everything, so I'm sure there will be at least some questions. And I really look forward to hearing from you. What else do you want to know about? What else do you want to hear about this topic? What did I miss? What did I forget? What do you want to hear about now? So thank you again for your attention. I really do appreciate what you do.
Thank you, Christine.
You're welcome.
Thank you, thank you. We do have something in the chat. Okay, a lot of thank yous out there. What we're gonna do now, since we do have some time, Christine, we're gonna go ahead and take some questions. I'll go ahead and start out here at the chapel. If there's somebody here in the chapel that has a question that I could ask Christine, you guys want to raise your hand or come up forward and I'll give you the mic, and we are on Zoom, so feel free please to come up. And if you guys have a question, anybody have a question here at the chapel? Okay, Gloria does. Gloria, you want to join us up here? Is it okay? Okay, we have Gloria is going to come and ask a question for us. See if she can hear.
I so appreciate your information that you gave us today. It was awesome. The question I have is, so many times when the babies are sent home from the hospital early, preterm or early like that, they have quite a regime, and many times they don't really understand. I think that they are maybe sometimes rushed out of the hospital, or and then maybe they don't really get support and lactation support, and there seems to be often a period gap where there's that connection from the hospital to maybe getting lactation support. And just what are your encouragement or your words of wisdom for those of us who maybe are following this type of infant?
Well, I would say that I'm sorry, are you hearing that echo? Okay.
Okay,
No.
there we go. Go ahead.
Oh no, that's very odd that happened. I'm sorry. Yeah, I mean, I think I see that too, but we see that with anybody who's struggling with establishing breastfeeding in the hospital, regardless of whether it's a late preterm baby, just a baby having difficulty latching, whatever it is, the hospital experience is incredibly overwhelming. And I think one of the most important messages that people can take home from the hospital is to reach out for help earlier. And, at the same time, encouraging pediatricians and well baby follow-up clinics to make sure that we're referring families back to lactation care as quickly as possible, because picking up on those kind of problems, it's so much better when we do it earlier. And, there's a lot of factors here, but anytime a baby is struggling in the hospital and we have to initiate pumping, the problem is we're set up to teach people a pretty small amount of skills. So we're set up to teach them about breastfeeding, maybe a little bit about pumping. So even in the best of situations, if somebody is sent home with breastfeeding education and some pumping education, they still need more in order to make it work. So no matter what the reason is for all the extra needs for the bottle feeding or the pumping or whatever extra they need, we aren't really set up to be able to provide all that education in the hospital experience. It's pretty frustrating for everybody all around. And again, with these preterm and late preterm babies, they didn't even have the time for all the prenatal education and care that they needed. So, you know, it's even more difficult for them. So I don't think there's an easy answer other than we keep talking about how late preterm babies are really different and have really different needs so that families and other providers really get it and they intervene earlier rather than letting them just flail around the way it seems to happen.
Thank you, Christine. For that, I do have a question from Jocelyn in the chat. How long does it usually take early term infants to establish good feeding? When can we start general education on breastfeeding?
So when we talk about early term babies, again, these are the ones who are born sometime in the 37th and 38th week. Some of them act like late preterm babies when it comes to feeding, but others act more like term babies. And the reason is because due dates are estimates, right? So some of them are actually older than we thought they were, and some of them are younger. So with early term babies, if they really are early term, they tend not to have these kind of feeding issues, especially after, if they're really truly 38 weeks, they're probably going to be okay right away, unless they have a different problem. But the ones who are in the 37th week, they could be more like in the 36th week. They also could be more like in the 38th. So it really depends on how good those due dates are, how good those estimates actually are. And, you know, after all of this time and all of our technology and everything that we know, we're still not totally good at explaining exactly why babies are born when they are.
Thank you, Christine. I have a quick question just regarding like growth spurts, because I know that's one of our, educations that we really share with mothers, prenatally and especially in the first couple of days, excuse me, when we're talking to them. How does that differ with these early term infants, since, they may be a little harder to wake in the beginning, or, we're monitoring more of their visits? Do they end up having growth spurts and they just are a little later on?
Possibly. Sort of just depends on how the trajectory of everything is in the beginning for them. But here's why this is an important question. Yes, we expect that they're going to have some difficulty getting established, but the expectations for how they're going to grow, as in terms of like on the actual growth charts, for the most part, babies who are outside of the NICU still use the same growth chart as babies who are born at term. So the expectations for their growth trajectory is still the same as a term baby, which means that we still expect them to be back to their birth weight by about 2 weeks. And we still expect them to continue growing after that and to never have any leveling off or dropping off of percentiles. But the thing is, with these late preterm babies, where are their growth spurts going to happen? It's really hard to say, because so many of them that we see are struggling and there's not a lot of data on that specifically. So that's why it's a really great question. It brings up a lot of great things to think about.
Yes, thank you. We have now a question from Carla in the chat. How do we begin the conversation of prepping the parent for the likelihood that their late preterm infant may need additional support?
You know, when you're in the hospital working with a family, they know when there's a problem with breastfeeding. If they're doing it, their baby is either not staying on, not latching at all, or they're starting, maybe they have been, but they're starting to show that they don't have enough intake because their diapers are low, or outside of normal limits. Maybe, other outcomes are starting to show themselves. So what we talk about with term babies is that we trust that exclusive breastfeeding is going to work, and we monitor and we watch for certain outcomes to make sure that it really is working, and we don't intervene unless it shows itself to be a problem. So for instance, with a healthy term baby, if we are not seeing the right amount of diapers on day 3, then we intervene, right? We figure out what needs to happen next. With late preterm babies, the recommendation from the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine is that we don't wait for problems to show themselves with these babies. We intervene from the beginning by hand expressing, feeding extra milk, and monitoring even more closely to make sure that they are taking in enough and having the right kind of outputs and health outcomes. So that's important, that's important way to think about it. And, it's good to bring it up as early as possible. As soon as, the first time that we're talking about breastfeeding with them, talking about the need for protecting milk production, because the baby isn't able to do that. They're not capable of being responsible for that. So it's going to be some extra work for mom to do that. And, not forever though, just for now. That's again, like the most important message that we can pass along to people. That's a big deal for them, especially if they never planned on pumping or expressing their milk in the first place. And I know that probably sounds a little out there because everybody expects that they're going to pump now. But honestly, there really are people there are still people who don't want to use a pump. And when we tell them that they're going to need to, that doesn't sound great for them. They're not that happy about it, but we can ensure that they understand that it doesn't have to be forever if they don't want it to be. And it can be hand expression if they really don't want to use a pump for any reason at all.
Thank you, Christine. Is there anybody else here at the chapel that would like to ask a question? We do have a question over here.
Hi. Is it on? Hi, I have a question about inducing labor. I know that this is something that people actually do for different reasons, whether it's medical or mental health issues. And I want to know, like, what is the safest way to go about this if someone has a reason? It may not be medical, but it may be mental health issue. And inducing labor is something that they would like to do or prefer to do. I don't know how you would address that. And like, what are the weeks that would be safe, and just some information that would be great.
I think what's important to think about in terms of induction of labor and late preterm babies is just accepting, again, that there are consequences to it that can make, that can be significant for both the baby and the parent when induction of labor happens before the due date. And, then looking at the risks of that. And that's an important conversation they need to be having with their medical provider, their midwife or their OB, so that they're making a decision that really takes into account all the potential risks of either remaining pregnant or having the baby right away, and all of those things. And sometimes it's very simple and straightforward, and, blood pressure is through the roof and we have to induce now. And other times it's less straightforward. It's more of, it feels like there's, it's just not as clear why it's being done or why it's being recommended. And all of those things just take conversation, but that conversation has got to include the potential risks to the baby of being born preterm. You know, we only talked here about babies who were not in the NICU, did not have breathing problems, did not have emergent medical problems after birth. We were talking about babies who are healthy, other than that they need some help with feeding. And, you know, parents need to take or to have that part of the conversation happening as well when they're considering induction for maybe non-medical reasons or for sort of, you know, there's a question there. Just thinking about the risks to the baby of being born before their due date. Again, we don't know, it's just an estimate, so we don't actually know how early they are, and sometimes those risks are bigger than others. Many late preterm babies go to the NICU because they have emergent medical needs, and that in itself is an interruption to lactation. So those are important parts of that conversation that do need to happen.
Thank you, Christine. Do we have any more questions for those on Zoom? Feel free to raise your hand and unmute. And it's okay, there's a lot of information that we took in today. And Christine, if you want to put in that slide again with your last one, that they could, or maybe just look, look her up on Instagram, reach out to her. She left her, the email address was there. So please, reach out to Christine, connect with her. Her email's there, and then also her Instagram. Thank you, Christine. We really do appreciate you. We are recording the presentation, and so we will be sharing that hopefully by this week. And we do apologize for all the technical difficulties we had, at the beginning of the Zoom, but a great presentation by you, Christine, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with those that were not able to join us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and look out at your email. We will be sharing an evaluation, and also that will give you an opportunity to get your CE. And if you're looking for the CMEs, we did share the QR code earlier because you do take a separate, it's a separate evaluation from the CE. Please email us if you did not get that. So if you're looking for a CME, please reach out to us. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great day.